Sarah Harper never believed in the impossible until the night her 8-year-old daughter, Emily, came back from the dead to warn her. Emily's body had been found in the woods, her life stolen by a killer who still roamed free. But when another child disappeared and another body was discovered in the same spot, Sarah knew the truth. Emily had returned, not just as a ghost, but as the key to unraveling the dark secrets of Hillcrest. The only question was, could Sarah stop the killer before he claimed another victim? Or was her daughter's return just the beginning of something far more terrifying? In the small, quiet town of Hillcrest, life moved at a slow pace. Neighbors waved to each other as they went about their daily routines, and children played in the streets without a care in the world. It was a place where nothing truly shocking ever seemed to happen. That all changed on a warm summer afternoon, when 8-year-old Emily Harper disappeared without a trace. It started like any other day. Emily had spent the morning riding her bike around the neighborhood, her laughter echoing down the quiet streets. Her mother, Sarah, watched from the porch as her daughter zoomed around the front yard, her pink bicycle a blur of color. It was supposed to be a simple afternoon of sunshine and fun, but as the hours passed, Emily never returned home. At first, Sarah wasn't too worried. Maybe Emily had gone to play at a friend's house or had wandered a little further down the street to visit the park. But as the day dragged on, a sense of unease began to creep in. By evening, the sun had set, and Emily still hadn't come back. Sarah's heart began to race. She called out her daughter's name, but there was no answer. Panic set in as Sarah ran through the house, checking every room, every closet, even the attic. There was no sign of Emily. She raced out into the front yard, calling her name again and again. Her voice cracked with fear, but the only sound that greeted her was the chirping of crickets in the growing dusk. By the time Tom, Emily's father, came home from work, the town had already been alerted. The police were contacted, and the search began immediately. It was hard to believe that a child could simply vanish in broad daylight, yet that's exactly what had happened. Officers combed through the streets, knocking on doors and asking questions, but no one had seen anything unusual. It was as if Emily had simply melted into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but an empty house and a mother on the verge of breaking down. As the hours turned into days, the search intensified. The police organized a formal investigation, bringing in canine units to track any scent, and even helicopter searches to cover more ground. The entire town rallied together to look for Emily, but despite their best efforts, there was no trace of the little girl. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, no witnesses. It was as if Emily had vanished into thin air. Days became weeks, and still, Emily was nowhere to be found. Flyers were posted around town, urging anyone with information to come forward. The community clung to the hope that she might be found safe, that some miracle would bring her home. But with each passing day, that hope began to fade. The police were no closer to finding answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at the edges of Sarah's mind. Was Emily really gone? Was there a chance she could still be alive? A few weeks later, a breakthrough came, but it wasn't the one anyone had hoped for. A body was discovered in the woods, about 15 miles from Hillcrest. The remains were in such a state of disrepair that it was nearly impossible to identify the child at first. But when the police showed Sarah a picture of the clothes found with the body, Emily's favorite dress, the one she had worn just days before her disappearance, Sarah's world shattered. It was her daughter. The unthinkable had become a horrific reality. Emily was gone. The town of Hillcrest was left in shock, trying to understand how something so unimaginable could happen in their peaceful little community. But Sarah couldn't accept it. She couldn't believe that her daughter was truly gone. The pain was too great. And somewhere deep in her gut, Sarah felt that the case wasn't over yet. There was something she wasn't being told, something no one seemed to want to acknowledge. She couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's death wasn't just a tragic accident. It was something much darker, something more sinister. And Sarah would stop at nothing to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing the unimaginable. The days following Emily's funeral were a blur for Sarah and Tom. The pain was all-consuming, as if the very air around them was thick with sorrow. Hillcrest, once a town full of life and laughter, now felt like a ghost town. People spoke in hushed whispers, glancing nervously over their shoulders. But for Sarah, the world seemed to have stopped moving altogether. The grief weighed on her like an unrelenting tide, drowning her in moments of silence, of memories that felt like sharp shards of glass. Sarah tried to go on with her daily routine, but it was impossible. Every room in their house was a reminder of Emily. Her room, with the pink walls and stuffed animals that still lay on the bed, as if waiting for her to return. Her favorite books were stacked on the shelf, untouched. The scent of her shampoo still lingered in the bathroom. Everything reminded Sarah of what was lost. Tom, on the other hand, seemed to withdraw further into himself. He wasn't the same man Sarah had married. His once steady presence had turned hollow, and he wandered the house like a ghost, not sure where to go or what to do. He barely spoke, and when he did, his voice was distant, as if he were speaking from far away. Their marriage, once a source of comfort, was now strained and fractured. Neither of them knew how to support the other in their grief, and in their silence they began to drift apart. The police, though sympathetic, had little to offer. The investigation into Emily's disappearance had gone cold. There were no clues, no witnesses, no leads. They had searched the woods where Emily's body had been found, but there was nothing more to uncover. The case was officially closed. The killer, whoever he was, had disappeared without a trace. No one seemed to know what to do next, and the authorities were all too eager to move on. The file on Emily Harper's case was tucked away, forgotten, gathering dust in some dark corner of the station. But not for Sarah. She couldn't let go. Something inside her refused to believe that Emily's death was just a random tragedy. The circumstances surrounding her disappearance didn't make sense. A child didn't just vanish into thin air, and the way Emily's body had been found, disfigured, almost unrecognizable, felt wrong. It wasn't like anything she had ever heard of before. This wasn't some tragic accident. This was something deliberate, something planned. Someone had taken Emily, and whoever that person was, they were still out there. She began to do her own investigating. At night, while Tom lay asleep, Sarah would comb through the police reports again and again, looking for a clue, anything that had been missed. She talked to neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen something strange or unusual the day Emily disappeared, but there were no answers. All she had were more questions. Who would want to harm her daughter? Why Emily? And why was everything so deliberately hidden? The town's police seemed to have given up, but Sarah couldn't. Then one evening, as Sarah was going through old photographs, a thought struck her. There had been something odd about the timeline of Emily's disappearance. At first, she had assumed it was just her grief clouding her memory, but the more she thought about it, the more it didn't add up. Emily had vanished in the late afternoon, but the body hadn't been discovered until weeks later, far from where she had last been seen. How could someone take Emily so far without being noticed? And why hadn't anyone seen anything suspicious? The more Sarah tried to make sense of it, the more the questions gnawed at her. It was as if there was something dark lurking beneath the surface, something no one wanted to acknowledge. She couldn't shake the feeling that the police were missing something important. The case had been closed too quickly, too easily, and in her heart, Sarah knew there was more to Emily's death than they were being told. Her obsession with finding the truth took hold of her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. She began to visit the cemetery where Emily had been buried, almost as if the answer could be waiting there, among the graves. The idea of letting go, of accepting that Emily was gone, was impossible for Sarah. Her daughter was out there, she was sure of it, and the killer hadn't been caught. If it meant turning Hillcrest upside down to uncover the truth, then that's what she would do. Because deep down, Sarah knew that Emily wasn't just a victim. There was something more to this story, something only she could uncover. Months had passed since Emily's death, and life in Hillcrest had settled into an eerie normalcy. The grief still lingered in the air like a thick fog, but the town had tried to move forward. Families returned to their routines. Children went back to school, and the shops along Main Street were bustling again. Yet there was an unspoken tension that seemed to hover over everyone. The disappearance of Emily Harper and the unsolved murder had cast a long shadow that no one could shake off. But just as people thought they could breathe again, another child went missing. This time, it was Lily Matthews, a 9-year-old girl who had been playing in her front yard when she vanished. It was the same story as Emily's, a carefree afternoon that turned into a nightmare. Lily's mother, Jane, was frantic, much like Sarah had been months earlier. She called the police, and within hours, a search began. This time, however, the town wasn't just worried. They were terrified. The sense of dread that had never quite left since Emily's disappearance now clung to every conversation, every glance exchanged between parents and neighbors. The police sprang into action, but there was something different this time. They couldn't ignore the connection between Lily's disappearance and Emily's. It was too similar. Both girls had been taken in broad daylight, both had been from families well known in the town, and both had disappeared without a trace. The community was in shock, but it wasn't just fear this time, it was suspicion. Who among them could be responsible for such a monstrous act? And how could someone so evil be hiding in plain sight? The search for Lily continued for days, but once again, the town came up empty. No clues, no witnesses, no sign of struggle. It was as if Lily had simply vanished into thin air, just like Emily. And then, as if mocking the hopes of everyone involved, a discovery was made in the woods. It wasn't far from where Emily's body had been found. The police rushed to the scene, and within hours, they confirmed that the remains were indeed Lily Matthews. Once again, the family was left shattered. Once again, the community was left in disbelief. The similarities between the two cases were too stark to ignore. The police began to piece together a terrifying pattern. Whoever had taken Emily had likely returned for Lily. But the real shock came when they discovered the location of the bodies. Emily and Lily had both been found in the same stretch of woods, the same area, though miles from where they had disappeared. The killer hadn't just been abducting children, he had been returning them to the same place to hide them. But why? What did that area have to do with his twisted plan? And then, a tip came in that no one could have expected. An anonymous caller contacted the police, claiming to have seen something strange near the cemetery, close to the woods where the bodies had been discovered. The witness described a little girl, but not any girl from the town. This girl was pale, almost translucent, and she was walking among the gravestones in the dead of night. The caller swore that the girl had no shadow, as if she didn't belong in the world of the living. The police were skeptical at first. Was this just another crank call? Was it a coincidence? Or was there something more to the story? The witness insisted that the girl had looked just like Emily Harper. The report was dismissed at first, but something about it struck a chord with the investigators. It was strange, yes, but there was an unsettling accuracy to the description of the girl. Whoever had called in had no way of knowing the details of Emily's appearance so precisely. The more the police dug into the tip, the more they began to wonder, could there be a connection between Emily's spirit and the case? But the idea was dismissed as quickly as it came. After all, there was no way Emily's spirit could help solve the mystery of her own death, let alone lead the police to a killer. And yet, as strange as it sounded, it began to feel as though Emily's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It was the beginning of something darker, something that had not yet revealed its true nature. As the investigation into Lily's death deepened, the police began to make connections between the two cases. The killer was still out there, hiding in plain sight, and the more they learned, the more they realized that no one was truly safe. It was as if the killer was watching them, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. And with each passing day, the shadow of fear grew larger, until it consumed the town entirely. The night Sarah Harper received the call, she was alone in the darkened living room, her face bathed in the pale glow of the TV. Tom had gone to bed early, exhausted from work, though Sarah knew he never truly slept anymore. His nightmares had become worse since Emily's death, and she found herself awake most nights, unable to quiet the frantic thoughts in her mind. Tonight was no different. She had spent hours staring at the empty space across from her mind a tangled mess of grief, anger, and suspicion. Then the phone rang. At first, Sarah didn't even move. It was just another late-night call, one of the many she'd ignored over the past few months. But this time the phone rang again, persistent, almost desperate. With a sigh, she stood up and walked to the hallway, where the dim light flickered from the kitchen. She picked up the receiver, her fingers trembling slightly, but when she pressed it to her ear, it was silent. Then a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Mom?" The voice was soft, breathless, but unmistakably Emily's. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her throat tightening. It couldn't be. Her mind raced. The logical part of her screamed that it was impossible, that it was some sick prank or a cruel joke. But the voice on the other end of the line, it was Emily. She knew it. She could hear the familiar tremor in her daughter's voice, the way Emily would always say "Mom" when she needed her. That soft lilt that only a mother would recognize. "Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking as she said her daughter's name. "Mom, I'm here," the voice responded, the words rushing out in a desperate, frantic tone. "I need you to help me. The killer is still here. He's still hiding in the town. He's not done." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make sense of it. Her daughter had died. Emily's body had been buried. She had seen the coffin lowered into the earth with her own eyes. And yet, here she was, speaking to her in the dead of night. Before Sarah could ask another question, the line went dead. She stood there, frozen, holding the receiver in her hand, her pulse pounding in her ears. She was certain now. This wasn't a prank. This was something real, something that transcended everything she understood. In that brief conversation, Emily had spoken as though nothing had changed, as if she was still alive, still in need of her mother's protection. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her jacket and rushed out of the house, her feet pounding against the cold ground. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. Emily was trying to tell her something. She had been led to the cemetery before. Why not now? Why not follow the same path? The night was unnaturally quiet as Sarah made her way toward the cemetery, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. The moon was obscured by clouds, casting a blanket of shadows over the small, abandoned graveyard. It felt wrong, yet strangely familiar. Every step she took brought her closer to the truth, or so she hoped. When she arrived at the cemetery gates, her heart began to race. The place felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by something darker, something sinister that lingered in the air, waiting to reveal itself. As Sarah ventured deeper into the cemetery, she saw something, or rather someone, a pale figure standing near the old stone walls, motionless, almost ethereal. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination. But as she drew closer, she could make out the shape clearly. It was Emily. The girl stood there, staring blankly ahead, her face pale and almost glowing in the dim light. Her hair, once vibrant and full of life, now appeared to float in a way that was almost unnatural. Emily's eyes, though wide open, were distant, hollow, and filled with an eerie understanding, as though she had seen things no child should ever see. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She seemed to be waiting for something. Sarah's breath, caught in her throat. This wasn't just a ghost. It was Emily, or something that looked like her, something that had returned, not from death, but from a place beyond comprehension. The child Sarah had lost so violently had come back, but now she was different. "Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this? What happened to you?" The child didn't respond, but her eyes flicked towards Sarah for a brief moment, as if she had heard her, as if she knew her mother was there. Then, just as quickly, she turned her gaze back to the dark horizon, her posture unnervingly still. Sarah felt the air grow colder, her body heavy with the weight of the moment. She wasn't sure what Emily wanted from her, but there was no denying it anymore. Her daughter was here, and she had come back to reveal something, to guide her, maybe, or to warn her. And in that moment, Sarah realized something terrifying. Emily's death was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The next few days felt like a blur of confusion, fear, and disbelief for Sarah. She had seen Emily in the cemetery, standing like a phantom in the shadows. It had been real, too real to be a dream or hallucination. But what did it mean? How could Emily be standing there, alive in some way, after everything that had happened? Sarah couldn't make sense of it. Her heart ached with both joy and terror as she wrestled with the impossible truth that her daughter had returned, not in body, but in spirit, or something even stranger. Sarah spent countless hours combing through old police reports and revisiting everything she thought she knew about Emily's death. The questions she had once dismissed in grief began to resurface. What if Emily had been trying to communicate something? What if there was more to her death than just a random act of violence? There had been a reason Emily's body had been found in that specific spot in the woods. Was it connected to Lily Matthews, whose body had also turned up in the same area? There were too many strange coincidences now, too many eerie similarities between the two girls' disappearances. Could the killer have been hiding in plain sight, right under everyone's nose? But there was one thing that Sarah was sure of now. Emily was trying to help. Her daughter had come back for a reason. She wasn't just a lost soul wandering aimlessly. She had a purpose. The chilling words Emily had spoken on the phone, "The killer is still here," were a beacon in Sarah's mind, pushing her forward. The killer hadn't been caught. He was still out there, watching, waiting. And Emily knew more than anyone could have imagined. With renewed determination, Sarah contacted the police again. She met with Detective Lawson, who had investigated Emily's case. Lawson was skeptical at first. He had seen too many desperate parents clinging to the hope of miracles, too many wild theories that led nowhere. But Sarah's insistence, and the undeniable conviction in her eyes, made him pause. He agreed. To investigate the cemetery and the connection between Emily's case and the new disappearances. The investigation into Lily Matthews' death had yielded little, but now, with Sarah's new insight, something shifted. They started looking at the cases through a different lens, one that acknowledged Emily's strange return. As they dug deeper into the timeline of the disappearances, a disturbing pattern emerged. It wasn't just the physical proximity of the bodies that tied the cases together. It was the way the victims had been taken. Both Emily and Lily had disappeared on warm afternoons, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The way they had been hidden, placed so deliberately in that same stretch of woods, suggested something far more methodical than a random act. It was then that Sarah recalled a strange detail from her own memory, something she had overlooked until now. Emily had always been drawn to the woods behind their house. When she was younger, she used to play near the trees, pretending they were magical forests full of secret paths and hidden places. Could it be that the killer had known this? Could he have chosen these places deliberately, knowing that Emily at least had a connection to them? Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in those woods, something that had to do with Emily's death, something the police hadn't yet uncovered. As the investigation intensified, the police began to focus on one suspect. It was a name Sarah had never suspected, but when the evidence pointed to him, it made a sick kind of sense. James Aldridge, a reclusive man in his mid-40s, had lived on the outskirts of Hillcrest for years. He was quiet, always keeping to himself, and had been in town just long enough to remain largely unnoticed. But after a thorough background check, they discovered something chilling. Aldridge had a history of violence. His past was full of disturbing incidents, none of which had ever been fully investigated. Sarah knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. Emily had led them here. She had come back not just to warn, but to help expose the truth. Emily had known something about Aldridge, something no one else had noticed. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, and now, thanks to Emily's guidance from beyond the grave, they could finally catch him. The police moved quickly to apprehend Aldridge, bringing him in for questioning. As they dug deeper into his life, they uncovered even darker secrets, evidence linking him to other missing children, not just Emily and Lily. The horror of it all hit Sarah with full force as the scope of Aldridge's twisted crimes became clear. He had been hiding his true nature for years, blending into the town's fabric like a ghost.